He earned his PhD at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland and a THM at Harvard Divinity School. He taught New Testament for several years at Trinity College in Deerfield, Illinois, and North American Baptist Seminary in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. Dr. McDonald has also served as senior minister in various churches over a period of almost 20 years, and has also served as a chaplain in the U.S. Army Reserve. Dr. McDonald was appointed principal of ADC in 1999, a rank that has since been upgraded to president. And along with Dr. Craig Evans, he has launched the Acadia Studies in Bible and Theology, which is published by Baker Academic. Thus far, 3 volumes have appeared in the series, with the 4th to appear next month. The papers presented in today's conference will be published in this series. Dr. McDonald has authored The Formation of the Christian Biblical Canon, 1st edition by Abingdon, 2nd edition by Hendrickson. A new, greatly expanded version of this work will appear in 2007 under the title The Biblical Canon, Its Origin, Transmission, and Authority, also by Hendrickson. Related to this is the massive collection edited by Dr. McDonald and Dr. James Sanders entitled The Canon Debate. Reviewed widely, this critically acclaimed book is now regarded as a who's who in the field of canon studies. Dr. McDonald has also published commentaries on Acts, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, and Galatians in the Bible Knowledge Background Commentary Series, edited by Craig Evans and much loved by seminary students everywhere. Finally, Dr. McDonald has co-authored, along with Stanley Porter, New Testament Introduction in the IBR Bibliographies series, published by Baker, and Early Christianity and its Sacred Literature, published by Hendrickson, which is required reading at Acadia. Dr. McDonald's paper is entitled Wherein Lies Authority, Books, Texts, and Translations. Welcome, Dr. Lee McDonald.
Thank you. And picking up on where Stan Porter was, I did change the title to this one instead of the other one. I'm not as smart as some of the others, and so it's harder for me to get my act together in that regard. And I would say, I remember I came home one time, I had a fight when I was in school, in grade school, and I got the worst end of it, and my dad reminded me a good retreat was better than a lousy stand, and so I should retreat from that earlier title rather than trying to stay with it. What I have to say in the area of biblical canon, I'm going to be focusing on the New Testament, and that's just primarily because of the time. And the paper that I have prepared is far too long for any reading, and I will spare you that, but I'll do some summarizing. And a number of the points that I really would like to make have been made in part earlier, and I especially appreciate some of the comments that Jim Charlesworth was saying, and I'll reiterate and give some further arguments for those along the way. But much of what I have to say is also true of the Old Testament textual tradition, as Professor Tove has very capably shown us already, and I have spelled that out in some other places. Canon inquiry, how we got our Bible, formation of the Bible, is a very complex subject. And it cannot be done adequately just by looking at one particular field. Anybody that looks at the origins of the Bible must know, if they're going to do both Testaments, they must know some Hebrew, some Aramaic, they must know Greek, they must know something about the introductory materials related in the historical context of both Testaments. Plus, they need to know a lot about textual criticism and a number of languages that come into place. Those who are going to do serious work in canon studies must also look at the translations of the Bible in the ancient world, and that's not just in the Greek. It was also in Latin, Syriac, and various other languages, the Georgian, the Armenian text, the Coptic text, and so on. All of these are very critically important for understanding how we got our Bible. I want to focus today on really books, texts, and translations, and what they have to say to us about the origins of the Bible. And they all have a particular note. And I would preempt some other perhaps comments a little bit later on. I'm stepping on all kinds of territory that others in this room are really terrific scholars in, and I'm going to walk all over the place. I told Stan Porter he's spent a lot of time, a lot more than I have, in papyri studies and textual manuscripts. And so tell me later, Stan, don't embarrass me too much along the way, but also some things that were said earlier by some of our other presenters. In terms of the books, that we're looking at the ancient manuscripts that we have, and I'll share a few more comments about them momentarily. But there are 5,735 New Testament manuscripts that exist. Now, that information I got from Bruce Metzger about a year ago, but it's likely to change almost every year. Among those, there's 117 papyri manuscripts, and that changes almost every year. When I think it was just about 6 or 7 years ago, I looked at some sources, and they were saying there were about 98, 99 of them, and it's grown. There are 310 majuscule manuscripts, sometimes called Uncial manuscripts, 4th century and following to about the 10th century AD, and those manuscripts are produced on parchment. They're beautiful, and we have a couple of examples to show you in that regard. And those manuscripts are very critical for establishing the text of the New Testament, and I'll say something more about those in a bit. But in the manuscripts, there's about, I think it's 2,877 minuscule manuscripts, or lowercase, with kind of a running style of writing. Those manuscripts date roughly from about 9th century, right on up to the time of the invention of movable type and the printing press. And all of those manuscripts, let me just put it up front, there are no two alike. 5,700 manuscripts. There are no two that are exactly alike. And interestingly, in the earlier part of the manuscript tradition, there are no two, actually there are none that have all of the letters of Paul, or the ones attributed to Paul, and there are none that have all of the books of the New Testament and only the books of the New Testament. Now, one of the peeves that I've had over the years, all of us get our Greek New Testaments, whether it's the UBS 4th edition, where Jim Charlesworth's colleague, Bruce Metzger, his predecessor, headed that, and I love it because it's easier for me to read than the Nestle-Aland text. I just got so used to these nice, clear, crisp letters in that Greek text. But there's really no essential difference between the Nestle-Aland 27th edition and the Greek New Testament of the United Bible Society 4th edition. All of them had these funny little charts that are in there. I don't know if any of you have ever looked at them and you say, oh, I look in here and I see EAPCR, those different letters that are coming in, and surely that means that this particular manuscript's got all of the Gospels in it, E for Evangelion. Or this one has the Acts and the Catholic epistles or general epistles, as in the A. And this says P, so it must have all of Paul's epistles, and so on. And you go through, and R is for the book of Revelation. But the fact of the matter is, none of those papyri have all of those things in them. And I would raise a question or two about it a little bit later on. These kinds of charts are often very deceiving, and there's a very significant one or two that I'll point out to you. I don't have time to go through a lot of them, but let me start with just the words, or the books themselves. The word codex is really a book form. It opens very much like this. It started with a single quire, and originally, and then it was bound together with several of these. And by about the year 200, you could get about 200 pages in them. But in the 1st century, there was probably not much more than about half of that. It could have been a little bit larger. But the codex, or the book, was essentially a notebook, a notepad, and something like a handbook in many cases. And the various pieces of literature that are found in them cannot be complete because all of the letters of Paul wouldn't fit on the earliest stages of the codex. But by the end of the 2nd century, it may well have been possible. You could get about 200 pages on the manuscript. The text that Stan Porter mentioned, P46, I think has 208 pages. We don't have the last handful of them, and we already know that all of the rest of Paul's epistles wouldn't have fit in there no matter how you squeezed it. And some suggest that maybe he was going to, the person saw that he was not going to make it. He starts off with larger letters and fewer lines on the page, and then by the time he's done, He's put about 4 or 5 more lines on the page, and the letters are even smaller. But even if you went that way, you still couldn't get all of the pastoral epistles in there. And the pastoral epistles and the letter to Philemon are missing from P46. Often people assume that there was a closed canon of Paul's letters that were circulating in the early church up till about the 2nd century. We don't have any evidence of that. The strongest that we have and the most complete manuscript is P46. At any rate, it's not complete, or at least maybe it was, but actually I don't think it is because it's a fragment, and the back part of it is broken off, and we know exactly how many pages were broken off, and they wouldn't include the rest of the letters that make up Paul's, the collection that is attributed to Paul in our New Testament. The other area that I'd like to focus on, and I'll come back to it in a moment, or the books in a moment, is the text. When I mentioned that there are no 2 New Testament texts exactly alike, of the 5,735, the last 2,432 manuscripts were lectionaries that were used. There were scriptures that were cited in the early churches. We don't have any 2 of them that are exactly alike. And so what we have today in terms of our New Testament is what's called an eclectic text, which is selected from a variety of various New Testament manuscripts. And that eclectic text has a number of footnotes at the bottom. The only place where the Nestle Aland 27th edition Greek text and this United Bible Society Greek text differ is on the footnote apparatus, not on the text itself. So some people have concluded we have the original text. Well, it's interesting to make that conclusion, and some will argue it. We don't have one manuscript out of the 5,735 that looks exactly like this. Not one. So the text that often is that elusive thing, the original text, which I'll get back to a little bit later and make some summary comments about it, continues to be elusive. There are a number of textual critical scholars now that have abandoned the pursuit of the original text altogether because we really don't know what we're looking for. Are we looking for what Jesus actually said or the Greek translation of it that you find in the Gospels? Are we looking for the original letters that Paul wrote? Were there 2 at Philippi, and the one begins, or to the letter to the Philippians, second one perhaps beginning in 3:1, where you have a change of tone and perhaps venue? Are there several letters at 2 Corinthians? Most scholars tend to think that at least minimally there's the one in chapters 6 and 7 that's inserted into the text a little later. No doubt, well, there are some doubts whether Paul wrote it, but I don't have any doubts about that. But 1 Corinthians 10 to 13 also are variations on, it's a change of tone and subject matter that's, the tone is pretty critical in the last part of 2 Corinthians. Were these letters written? I don't doubt that Paul wrote the whole of 2 Corinthians, but I'm not sure that he wrote it all at the same time. And what is the original text that we're really looking for? Helmut Kester has reminded us that Matthew and Luke made use of Mark, but probably not the Mark that we currently have, but perhaps an earlier edition of Mark. Interestingly also, in the first 100 years after the writings of the New Testament are mostly done, we don't have any textual traditions of any significant size. We only have 2 small papyri with a few verses of each, P52 and P90, that have just a few verses from the Gospel of John, but we don't have much of a textual tradition in the 2nd century for 100 years. So we really haven't got any absolute assurance that what we have here in this eclectic text is actually what it really was originally. And so now there's more of a focus on looking at the social context of the text rather than trying to establish that. Though I have absolutely no problem with trying to get as early as we can. I would far rather know what Paul had to say than what a scribe in the 3rd or 4th or 5th century or later thought Paul should have said, and they stick it in there. So as close as we can get, I'm not abdicating that it's not of interest, but it may not be a possible achievement in here. Anyway, the third area that I'll look at just briefly again is the area of translations. The oldest translation, we think, may be the Syriac about 200 AD, or the Latin. It could be that there was a Latin text floating around of various New Testament texts toward the end of the 2nd century. In that context, the writings of the New Testament as we currently have it are not found in any one of the oldest 12 translations of the New Testament. Now, let me come back to that. I put that stuff out on the front. I wanted to get it said lest I run out of time. I give a sort of an annual showcase review of my research in this room, and they have a gong up here, and at 3 minutes they gong you. I've been gonged every time I've gone up there. I never finish on time. Anyway, but Bob is going to tackle me, and so is Craig Evans, so I'm going to work through with that. Let me give you an example of a couple of manuscripts, the earlier biblical manuscripts of Acts and one of the Thessalonian letters. Isn't it amazing what some of the textual critical scholars have to work with? That's only about 3.5, 4 inches long, and that's about as good as it's going to get. And they use all kinds of tools to try to get into that text, and they have to have some conservative guesses as to what goes into it. Here's another one as well. The papyri manuscripts are very fragmented in places, and these are some examples of some of those fragments. This is a little bit more so. This one, you can't see the bottom of it very much, but it's a part of the Gospel of John. I think it's what it is. This is a very nice one. It's called Codex Claromontanus, 5th to the 6th century AD. And you say, wow, that's pretty good. It's a little fuzzy right now because I got it from Craig Evans. But it's a little fuzzy here and there, but you get the idea. It's a little bit, quite a bit more clear, and that's when the parchment manuscripts are being made. Very nice addition. I'm going to move to, let me just leave the previous one up there for a second. There we go. And share just a couple of things about these manuscripts. One of my struggles with this chart is that it doesn't tell us what actually goes into these manuscripts. One of the earlier manuscripts, P72, which dates somewhere between the 3rd and 4th century AD, is the oldest manuscript of Jude and 1st and 2nd Peter. And so what you have in this chart is a C, which says Catholic epistles. And notice the order, it's Jude in 1st and 2nd Peter in the manuscript. But what this doesn't tell you is that the manuscript also has the Nativity of Mary, or the Apocalypse of James, the Corinthian correspondence with Paul, 3rd Corinthians, the 11th Ode of Solomon, then Jude, followed by Melito's homily on the Passover, a hymn fragment, the Apology of Phileas, Psalms 33 and 34, and finally, 1 Peter. Now, wouldn't you like to have known that in here? Anyway, but the one thing that we do know is that these manuscripts functioned in a sacred way in the congregations that received them. And they have more than what we currently have in a number of cases. Sometimes they have considerably less, but sometimes they have more than what we have in our current New Testaments. In P46, I'd only add a comment to Stan's word. As you know, Eldon J. Epp, also a textual critical scholar, uses P47 or 46 to speak about 7 churches that are mentioned in there, and he suggests that Philemon, which is missing from that manuscript, there was plenty of room for Philemon to be added at least, and the Lord knows what else went in there to fill up the rest of the manuscript of the pages that were broken off. But there are 7 churches. And where else do you get 7 churches found somewhere, like in Revelation chapters 2 and 3? And it may also be, Paul may be the one behind whom and upon whom that 7 church tradition is built. And Ignatius at the early 2nd century writes 7 letters to 7 churches also. Not the same as what Paul did, but you will see that. A more interesting example here is the Oxyrhynchus papyri that dates between 3rd and 4th century, though some of those papyri are a little bit later than that. the contents from the New Testament perspective, from the Oxyrhynchus Papyri, are Matthew, Luke, Acts, Romans, 1 Corinthians, listen to what you don't hear, Galatians, Philippians, 1 John, Jude, and Revelation. What is missing from our New Testament is 2 Corinthians, Ephesians, Colossians, the pastorals, Philemon, 1 and 2 Peter, and 2 and 3 John. Mark and 1 Peter are added by a later hand, perhaps around the 5th to the 6th century A.D. C.E. The non-canonical literature that's also found there that you never hear referenced in most textual critical works on that particular passage when they're trying to establish the New Testament text is that you also have the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary, the Acts of Peter, the Acts of John, the Acts of Paul, the Didache, Sophia Jesu Christi, the Gospel of Peter, the Apocalypse of Peter, 3 unknown sayings of Jesus, and Paul and Thecla. Isn't that amazing? All of those other things. Now, the interesting thing is that all of those documents were lying side by side in the same pile at Oxyrhynchus, and absolutely no way to distinguish them. Were these sacred texts of that early Christian community? Probably they were. I'm going to skip to a couple of other items. I have several other examples listed in the outline that I've given to you. Let me go to the majuscules, which are really at the heart of what we base much of our New Testament textual criticism on, and mention that Codex Vaticanus, which you see a copy of up here, has everything in our current New Testament except the pastoral epistles and Philemon. There's a question about Revelation because, thank you, Bob, that says 10 minutes. Thank you. Because this particular volume ends right in the middle of chapter 9, verse 14 at Katharai in Hebrews, the book of Hebrews, and there's a later hand in the 15th century that adds the rest of the book of Hebrews and the book of Revelation. Now, there are some that say because some of the other uncial manuscripts had the pastoral epistles, then surely this must also have had it, so it's fragmentary, and it probably would have followed Hebrews because those texts don't. And sequence isn't of major consequence. Hebrews comes in a variety of places in some of the early manuscripts, so that's a possibility, but it's an argument from silence, and we don't have a great deal to justify that. Codex Sinaiticus, 4th century manuscript, has all of the New Testament plus Barnabas and the Shepherd of Hermas added to it. Codex Alexandrinus, a 5th century manuscript, has all of the New Testament plus 1 Clement and the Psalms of Solomon in the New Testament section. Codex Beza, or Cata Brigiensis, 5th century manuscript, has the 4 Gospels, Acts, 3 John, and it's found in Greek and Latin. And then the Ephraemi Rescriptus Palimpsest, it's a text that was put in, and then it was washed over, and somebody used it for something else, but we've been able to recover that. Has everything but 2 Thessalonians and 2 John. Claremontanus, which you find up here, omits Philippians, 1 Thessalonians, Hebrews, and it adds the Shepherd of Hermas, the Acts of Paul, and the Apocalypse of Peter. There are a number of these variations in the manuscripts, but these are among the most important of the uncial manuscripts, or the capital-lettered majuscule manuscripts that we deal with. In terms of the uncial manuscripts, they have most of the New Testament, but they don't have all of what's now in our New Testament. And none of these early manuscripts have only the books that are found in our New Testament. There are 55 out of 2,877 manuscripts that have the whole New Testament. There's no, well, I'll skip an item off over here. The earliest pure, complete, non-composite New Testament manuscript that has all of the books that we have in our New Testament and no others was found at Mount Athos. It dates 1116 CE. So that's quite a considerable gap in some of the manuscripts. The point is that all of these manuscripts functioned as sacred scripture in the communities that had them, and they didn't have the same texts. And for the vast majority, at least the first 1,000 years of the church's existence, they didn't have the same Bibles that we have today. And it actually continues on for a period longer. Now let me say briefly something about the texts themselves. Of all of these 5,735 manuscripts, how many textual variants are there? I promise you I have not counted them. I have read 3 different scholars. One conservatively says 200,000. Another says 300,000, and Eldenep says 400,000. But any one of those is larger. There are more variants in the manuscripts than there are words in the New Testament. That's incredible, isn't it? That's quite a statistic. What we have to say, the early church noted a lot of the variants, and there are several of the early church fathers, Irenaeus, of course, Origen, who tried to put in parallel columns a copy of the scriptures, and he tried to weed out some of those variants. Eusebius mentions them, Augustine mentions them, Jerome mentions them with a great deal of sadness. Bruce Metzger said, speed in production outran accuracy of execution. The variants simply say to us, I think in a very real sense, the church grew rapidly. And those who produced the manuscripts were not, thank you, that says I've got 5 to go. Those who produced the manuscripts were not professional scribes. Those who produced them were generally called, and Bruce Metzger and Bart Ehrman call them, literate amateurs. And when they were under pressure to produce a manuscript rather quickly, they made a lot of mistakes. There's a lot of errors that are found in the manuscripts, and the textual critical scholars try to correct those. So did some of the subsequent copiers try to copy them and correct those errors, but they made other errors themselves. And Jerome says this, some of those people, some of the copiers, write down what they find, but what they think is the meaning. They write down not what they find, but what they think is the meaning, and while they attempt to rectify the errors of others, they merely expose their own. There are a number of changes in the text that are also not just accidental, but intentional. And Bart Ehrman wrote a book on the orthodox corruption of the Scriptures a few years ago, and then something much more popular, Misquoting Jesus, where he cites a number of these. And I've got one that I'll mention here. If you can see, and all of you can read this, of course, it's the end of the Gospel of Mark. It ends with Ephebunta Gar, which is speaks of the women who went out and they said nothing, for they were afraid, Ephebunta Gar. And the only place in the Codex Vaticanus that has a complete blank column, and you can see this one off over here starts Luke on the next page, but Mark stops here. Generally, they'll stop in the middle of a column, and then they'll start the next text here. This is, you can see the print from the other side. But Mark seemed to know that something else was due, but later on some other people found it, and it's called verses 9 to 20 that no New Testament scholar today says was original to the text. There's several, in fact. I had a friend, Paul Maricki, I don't know if you know Paul, who's an epigrapher but also a New Testament scholar. He did his dissertation on that at Harvard on that particular text. There are a number of these manuscripts. Let me just note a couple here. This is the end of Galatians, and then, of course, Ephesians starts at that point. This is an example of how it's normally done, where you let go the rest of the column and you start the book on the next column. And the only place where we don't have that in Codex Vaticanus is here in the end of Mark, which says the copier knew something else was necessary, and most scholars, let me clarify that. The most intelligent New Testament scholars don't believe that the Gospel of Mark concluded at verse 8. But we don't have the end of Mark's Gospel, and that's my own feeling on that one as well. We don't know what it is, but all of the modern translations essentially say we don't have it. And it stops there, and some think it should have stopped there, and that was a good, perfectly logical place to stop, but that's not really the case. This one shows Romans following, and because it's the first of Paul's collection, following the book of Jude. You can't see that clearly, but you see some different sequences that are found in the New Testament manuscripts. And this, of course, is the end of Romans and the beginning of 1 Corinthians in that same manuscript. There's some other things that I'd like to point out. I don't have time to. If you take a look off over here, there's two dots. Do you see those? This is that famous text, 1 Corinthians 14, verses 34 and 35, which a number of New Testament scholars believe was misplaced in the text of Paul. It's the one that forbids the women to have, they're to be silent. And most New Testament scholars forget the most. Several of them are beginning to say it doesn't make sense for that text to be where it is. It actually reads very well. If you took those two verses out, it makes much more sense to read it as it is. And it wouldn't make any sense to have 1 Corinthians 11 telling women to prophesy with their heads covered, and then by chapter 14 telling them to keep their mouths shut. I mean, I don't know how you reconcile those kinds of things. But in terms... Thank you very much. Donnie, I'm going to get you one of these days. I'm going to come to your church and embarrass you. Anyway, again, the pursuit of the original text is been largely marginalized today. There are still a few textual critical scholars think that, yeah, we still need to pursue it. And I think unless there's some major new finding that someone finds along the way, I don't think that's going to add a great deal to what we have in our current eclectic New Testament, Greek New Testament. Let me just briefly say at the, by way of summary, the translations. All of those translations, it takes a lot of tough work to translate a biblical text. And it's not done lightly, and you don't do it for something that's not worth much. And all of the translations functioned as sacred literature in the communities that received them. And none of them are the same, and none of the earliest ones have the same books in them. And it lets us know what literature really informed the faith of that earliest community. And some of them have non-canonical writings in that literature. The largest, and I've listed the various ancient translations for you, the largest one is the Ethiopic version, which has over 80 books into it, if you add the additional books in the Old Testament or First Testament, plus Synodos, First Clement, the Book of the Covenant, and Didascalia. The significance of all of that is simply that the early Christian community functioned with what they had, and they used it, and the manuscripts that they left behind were sacred scriptures to them. This was something they were passionate about. And incredibly, we have not one church father that says that the writings that were in translation were less inspired than those that were in the Greek text, or the Hebrew text for that matter as well. I think that's significant for us, and I'll just give my final summary comment here. I don't want to focus on too many other things, but let me just say, how significant is it for the church today that the earliest churches did not have the same scriptures that we have? And what are we going to do about that? That's not open for debate. That is a fact, and up through at least 1,000 years of the church, that's true, and even longer in many cases as well. Historically, the church's theology has been established without original manuscripts. And it's been established in translation, as Glenn so ably shared before. Yet there's no major Christian doctrine that hinges on a variant of the New Testament text. Of the 400,000, there's no new significant issue of faith that hinges on it. Most of the changes of the text move toward orthodoxy and not toward heresy, and not having the originals does not negate the impact of New Testament writings had on those who read them and obeyed their message. And that is still true today. Thank you very much.